Greetings, Diocese of Olympia, and everyone who may be watching. In September of 1967, the General Convention of the Episcopal Church was held here in Seattle. Then Presiding Bishop John Hines, former Bishop of Texas, said these words in his opening remarks and in his remarkable call for the Church to set its sights and resources on being part of the solution to the racist reality of our country. It was a time a lot like this, great attention on the racial injustice and calls, even violent calls, for change. The presiding bishop said this that day, speaking of just how desperate people of color were and are, and how far that desperation had propelled them. He said, "This, bringing equality and justice to their people, they are prepared to do, even if they have to die in the attempt." Further, and this touches us at a sensitive point, these unfortunate people, many of them, have written off the church as possible allies in their quest for justice, for they have seen little concrete evidence that church people are concerned about their plight or will take the necessary risks to help redeem it. He went on, "In trying to hear what is being said in the confusion of our time, I have walked a little bit in the ghetto areas, two of our cities. I can only tell you what I know now from an unrehearsed face-to-face confrontation with black people, some militant leftists, others solidly moderate, most of them bearing in their souls and some on their bodies the indignities and brutality which have erupted in anger and rebellion. I believe that people in all walks of life, church people in our own land and abroad, the people from whom hope is being squeezed out, want to know where we as Christians stand and whether our position is manifested in deeds that cannot be misunderstood." 1967. It's now 2020. Presiding Bishop Hines spoke those words over a half-century ago. They are sadly just as true today. I have shared when I ask, and sometimes when I haven't been, my views on race. For me, as with all of us, it has to start by me telling my story. I was born in Omaha, Nebraska when I was just 6 months old. My family moved to Washington, D.C., where my father entered graduate school at Gallaudet College there, training for his master's in deaf education. We were there for the assassination of President John F. Kennedy and for the March on Washington. There, I had an African-American woman who cared for me every day, as my father was in school and my mother worked as a nurse. Of the very few things I remember during that time in my life, one that is there is of this fabulous woman. I remember her. She was so loving, and indeed my parents both, when they told me this story, would smile at the way she would call me her baby. What I know now is that my parents loved this woman and yet knew very little about her life. I would call my parents some of the most radical liberals of the era. Both of my then were preoccupied in many ways, but at least openly supportive of the civil rights movement in this country. I remember many a lecture from my mother and father on the topic. After D.C. and a stint back in Nebraska, we moved to Little Rock, Arkansas. I was 5 years old. My father was the assistant superintendent and the football coach at the Arkansas School for the Deaf. His students were almost entirely African American. His staff, remarkably, were as well. It was at this moment in my life where I first remember the inequality and the segregation. I remember, not all of the details, but the tension when some of my father's staff came to our home, a mobile home trailer precisely, and others in our trailer park found interesting ways to ask why it was that black people were seen going in our house. I remember an African-American friend in that park. We would ride bikes together, and even now I more recognize the rather forced separation of the two of us. I also remember that his part of the park was all black, and that was the only place you would see them living. I carried that all into junior high. One day I came home from school and my mother was there on this day off of work. She asked me how my day went, and I said it was fine, and then offered school would be so much better if it wasn't for those, and I used the N-word. Of course, this was something I was hearing constantly at school by all my peers. I know now I was probably testing it all out on my mother, and I can report the test did not go very well. What I remember to this day is suddenly having a sharp pain in my face and looking up from the ground at my mother, who for the first and only time I can remember, struck me so hard when I said that. It's a moment seared in my memory. That and her standing over me, pointing her finger at me and saying, "I better never hear that word come out of your mouth again. If I hear it, or even think you're thinking it, you are going to get another moment to remember later." After that, I decided which side I was on, that it was indeed wrong to say such things and to believe them. I began the very ubiquitous white person journey on this, and that is to make myself a nice person. To make sure I didn't tell racist jokes, was careful with words, curious, learning a bit along the way, but mostly learning how to survive in a world torn apart on this by how to avoid it. I guess you could say at this point in my life it went underground and it kind of hibernated, and I didn't grow much in it. If you'd asked me if I was a racist, I would have definitely said no. I would have said something like our president says now whenever he's asked, "I'm the least racist person you ever known." I know those words, or something like them, have come out of my mouth over the years. That's because the prevalent and most accepted definition of racism, especially among white folk, is of some outward act, an outward word, an action that is seen as racist. The idea being, as long as you do the right thing, walk the right line, don't stray from this line or that, you can safely say you are not a racist. And I would say that has been the prevailing definition for most of our history with this, and surely still is. And I believe that definition is what is one of our major barriers, the roadblock to making any progress on this, the reason we keep coming back to this time and time again when something happens like the death of George Floyd that we simply cannot ignore or explain away or sweep under the rug. I had to evolve on this notion. In my 20s, I did my residency in hospital administration in Beaumont, Texas, just miles from the home of the Grand Dragon of the KKK. I worked for a wonderful African-American man, a friend and a mentor to this day. I learned so much from him. And whether I liked it or not, I learned of the ways he had to adjust his life to live in such a place, and in ways, although he was my superior and my hero, I could not deny were discriminatory, and which revealed to me just how unjust this culture is. I could deny the baggage of our past. He had to live it every day. It was as real as every step he took. A few years later, I found myself in seminary in Austin, Texas. In a similar moment as this, the seminary brought in the Reverend C.T. Vivian, an African-American preacher who worked and walked with Martin Luther King Jr., and who MLK once wrote of him, quote, "He is the greatest preacher to ever live." He is famously the preacher who spoke on the Selma courthouse steps and then was slugged in the face by Sheriff Jim Clark. His workshop style was one of confrontation. That's not a style I would think would work, and indeed wouldn't for many, but all I can say is, uncomfortable as it was, it worked for me. By then I was attending a historically African-American parish. I considered myself a progressive and on the right side of all this. I was one of the good guys. And so on that day when Reverend Vivian came to campus, he selected out of the crowd of about 70 students 10 who would come down and be on the floor with him for the entire day. We were told the doors had been locked, that you had to stay for the whole day. It began with so much tension, so much division. There were 8 white folks and 2 people of color on the floor, both African American, one from my parish I was attending. Reverend Vivian started by saying he was going to ask a question for each of us to answer, and this was his question. When you get up in the morning and you look into the mirror and you know you have to go out into this world we live in now, what do you think about? He purposely asked the white folks first and then finally the African Americans. I remember not listening much to what they said. I was focused on what I had said. A fumbling answer, because it is such a weird question, I thought at the time. Only later, because I was so occupied with myself, did I ask someone how the people of color had answered that question. I was astounded at what they said, and even more how little of it I had heard. The day essentially went like this. Reverend Vivian would simply go about some seemingly normal activity, maybe playing some jazz and telling us about the musician, what they went through, etc. And then he would ask us questions. And he basically belittled, beat us up, discriminated against all the white members of that 10 for about 8 hours. He made our lives miserable. So much so, one of the white people left before the day was over. Some of the white students who only had to watch refused and left. I hung in there mostly out of spite and my determination not to have this mean man win. And I did. I made it to the end of the day. And at the end, Reverend Vivian put his cards on the table. He said what he had been up to, how hard it was for him to do it, and that indeed reconciliation is possible, or he hoped it would be. And he proceeded to go down the line and ask each to stand up. He took both our hands in his. I remember at one point one of our white men in the line refused to hold his hands. He took our hands and he asked for forgiveness. He said he saw the good in our souls. He said he considered me his brother, and he hoped for the same, but he also said to me, stop shuffling, stop shadow dancing, stop avoiding this. He hugged me and asked if I would bless him, which I did. After all of that, he said, I have one final question for all of you here to answer. If you got up in the morning and you looked in the mirror and you knew you'd have to come back in this room with me, what would you think about? And literally, in that moment, like a ton of bricks, the revelation, and now I would say conversion, came over me. My mind and heart just screamed out, I am a racist. I am a white male raised in the South, marinated in this society, marinated in the unjust systems of white privilege and supremacy. In short, instead of continuing to run from the diagnosis, which I do believe is the defense mechanism most employed by whites, I accepted it. I'm sick. I'm a racist. It was devastating and liberating all at the same time. Only some time later did I say, I'm sick, but I'm going into recovery. Now I will tell you, if asked, are you a racist? I always answer yes, but that I'm in recovery. I still fall back. I still need to be conscious. I still have lots to learn. I still have blind spots. But I finally admit that I'm sick, and you cannot truly get well unless you're willing to admit that. For me, racism comes with power. I'm not afraid to say I come to any situation, and indeed just simply living in the world with all of that on my side, in my lineage, at my disposal. So it's my belief, my way of being around this now, to believe in this country that there can be truly deemed racist. The only people are white people. Other minorities cannot be racist, not by my definition. Now, they can be extremely prejudiced. They can be extremely violent with that, mean, judgmental, even evil, all of it, as any human can about just about anything. When I'm asked to talk about this in public, I often ask the people in the room, how many of you are prejudiced? And I basically say, if you all didn't raise your hand, you're lying, delusional, or asleep. Every human is prejudiced. Our brains are wired to be prejudiced. Racism comes with the added power that derives from being part of the predominant race in a culture. We have seen this dynamic happen in culture after culture. Sometimes the racists are black, sometimes white, sometimes from one bloodline versus another. But when it comes to power and acting on the prejudiced notions in our mind to form our world, this is where racism comes in and where it resides in this country, in our reality today. I'm not asking you to adopt that stance or belief. I know many will and do disagree, but I'm simply being open and transparent as to how I see it and live it today. We have serious work to do, long-term work to do in this church, and we are committed to doing that in this diocese. As I've said, we will need great patience, great gentleness, great courage to go this line, but I see no other option than to join in this moment with full dedication. I can only hope that in our discussions, we don't attempt to buy our way out of this. That, my friends, has been tried. I think money can and should come into this, but I will also say that we often use that, a form of power in this culture, to keep us from doing the much more sacrificial, much more meaningful work of working on ourselves. I started with the General Convention of 1967, and our then presiding Bishop John Hines, a man I was so blessed to know and to sit with on occasions from my Austin days. Bishop Hines said this in that presentation: but I would heavenly underline a word of caution. No matter what this church at the national level may decide we can do, both in human and financial terms, it will be only a token, a symbol, and perhaps happily a sacrament. What we do here can never be more than an earnest pointing to the necessity for and the effectiveness of a sensitive and sacrificial response on the part of the people of the church. For unless our men, women, and young people enlist in patterns of diocesan, parish, and mission engagement, which involves them personally as well as financially, even the best efforts at this level will prove fruitless. What is before us, he said, is not primarily a matter of money. Money can help if we take our hands off its control, giving it because we realize that it's God's and not ours. But if we attempt to use money to buy our way out of responsibility, the less credible we will appear to men and women struggling with their misery, and the less likely we are to build our part of a bridge between our alienations. Perhaps we can understand a little that it is only through our sharing in the pain and agonized frustration of the dispossessed that our own renewal can come to be. This is where I would urge you to be a bit selfish and even more introspective, because I do believe the only way truly forward in progress on this is for white people to own the need for our renewal, to own the need for our change, to be vulnerable and courageous enough to own the part we play and the illness for which we need a cure. For as the presiding bishop ended his words over 50 years ago, I believe they are just as true today, and I hope more will come from this realization than has till now. He said this, "For it may be that we are in a moment of passing grace given to us by God that may never again recur, and in which we are given together the opportunity to act. This journey will take us all, and in fact, I believe if most of us do not choose to join it, to do it, to truly engage it, this will not be the last time we will come to such a moment like this, and we will lose this moment of passing grace, and in the process, more of our siblings of color. Let's be the generation of courage and take this on now. It is what our baptismal covenant is all about. It is the gospel. It is our way to follow the way of Jesus, the way of love." Thank you for taking time to listen, and blessings to each and every one of you.